Okay. Okay. Yeah. David, I hope you don't mind that we record the session just like last time.
No,
Okay.
that's fine. Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Peter.
All right. Good morning, Goa Banker George. I thank you for coming to the commercial meeting today. We are going to have Mr. David Fu as our keynote speaker again today. Like last month, we have him come to talk to us about the apartment investment, and today he's going to go on with his series on real estate topic, and he's going to talk about the retail and office building investment. It will be a very interesting topic. Well, most of you have known David or have met him at this through Zoom. So I'm not going to repeat his credential today. Suffice to say that he's a very well-known attorney in San Gabriel Valley, and he has ample of knowledge and experience in real estate. Um, and as I told you during our Monday meeting this week, there are a couple of laws that favors the conversion of commercial to residential, and also conversion of office building and retail spaces to residential because of the housing shortage. So it's going to be very interesting playing field for the developers in 2023 because of all these changes. And I'm sure that David will, lead us to into some of the insight about some of these changes, and hopefully you can learn from it. So there's going to be a lot of information to be covered today, so I'm not going to waste too much time in the introduction. So without further ado, let's welcome David Fu. David.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much for having me appear for Coldwell Banker George again. You know, you're very old friends of mine, and I always love to come out and speak for you folks. I'm looking forward to when we're doing that a little bit more often in person. I think that's always fun, and I always try to draw people into the talk a little bit more that way. On Zoom, it's incredibly convenient, and I really enjoy being able to do these presentations on Zoom as well. But there's nothing better than that human interaction, and we all work in a people business or in people businesses, and we all know how important that is to have that personal connection. But I think that this is the next best thing, and we're going to make it work today. I think what I'll do now, Peter, is go ahead and share my screen and get to our PowerPoint. Okay.
Okay.
So let's see, I think if you allow me, right, we could do that. And let's start here. Okay, so again, thank you very much for having me, everyone. It's good to see you online. Again, my name is David Fu. I'm the principal of a small law firm here in the Arcadia area, which specializes mostly in real estate. And the reason for that is because prior to coming to practice law 26 years ago, I was an investment real estate broker. I sold shopping centers, apartment buildings, office buildings, land for development, industrial. And I had a kind of interesting career. I started in the late 80s, actually in residential in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm from the Los Angeles area. I grew up in Beverly Hills. I went to Berkeley. I was introduced to a friend of mine who would become my first broker. And I don't know if many of you are members of ARIA, but my first broker was the founder of ARIA. You're the first president of ARIA, John Wong. If you've met John over the years, he's very active at CAR and NAR. And if you're active in organized real estate, pretty much everybody knows who John is. In any event, I moved back to Southern California and I switched over to investments. And it's funny, I did it because my family's very close to the family that owns Panda Express. And a lot of people know Andrew Chern, the chairman of Panda, and he's a very old friend of ours. I've been knowing Andrew since I was 12 years old. I've known him for 50 years. And he called me one day and said, "Why are you in the Bay Area?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing real estate. I'm doing this and that. And he said, well, you're going to come back, aren't you? And I said, I guess so, eventually. And he said, well, why don't you do it now? And he said, the real estate business is an information business. You are learning information in a market you're not going to stay in. How is that going to help you if you're going to come back here? You should be here now, picking up information here. And, you know, he's a self-made billionaire. I usually listen to him. And you know, back then, he wasn't a billionaire yet, but we were still very good friends, and he was a very, very wise man. And so I listened to him, and I returned to Southern California. In any event, I started in the 80s when the market was go, go, go. And about 1990, 91, the market crashed, as many of you know. I was recruited then to go to Kennedy Wilson, which was on its way to becoming the world's largest real estate auctioneer. Our sales at Kennedy Wilson increased 2,000% over 4 years. And we were sort of the bright shining spot, the oasis in the real estate market in 1990, 91, and 92. When I was recruited there, they were primarily a residential brokerage. And so I was brought in to liquidate commercial portfolios for First Interstate Bank that doesn't exist anymore, Glendale Federal Bank that doesn't exist anymore, and a bunch of other banks that don't exist anymore, and Bank of America, which is still around. So I did that for about a year, and then I left, and then I started law school. So the reason why I do these presentations for you is because I have this background in the field, and since then I've continued to work very extensively in real estate. I served as the chair of the real property law section for the state bar, and I'm considered to be something of an expert in this field. So today what we're going to do is we're going to review a little bit of what we did the last time, so please excuse me. I think it's good for you. It's been a month since we spoke. And a lot of the time, people don't remember what I said anyway. So a little bit of repetition's not bad. You know, Anthony Robbins says that repetition is the mother of skill. And so hopefully this will help you to enhance your skill and knowledge of investment real estate in general. Because the initial part of it is sort of the parts that are universal across the field and discusses concepts that we have covered the last time. Remember that this is just a basic overview of investments. We're not going to have time to get into a lot of nitty gritty. And, you know, I construe that market as divided into two pieces, the apartment style investments and leased investments. So the last time we talked about apartments. This time we're talking about leased investments. And again, we're going to review the concepts that we went through initially. I'm going to remind you that although I'm a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer unless you're my client already. Some of you are. That I'm not giving any tax or legal advice today, and that this session is for informational purposes only. So I want to remind you, though, although we're going to review valuation tools and approaches, that be careful of performing what you would call a valuation and definitely an appraisal. Unless you're a licensed appraiser, pardon me, unless you have specific qualifications to perform valuations, you should be aware of doing that kind of service, performing that kind of service for your client. It's not clear to me whether that service would be covered under your current E&O policy. And therefore, you want to be very careful about overstepping what are the limits of your knowledge. No one wants to come across to their clients as being unknowledgeable. Although, to be honest with you, what I always say to clients is if I don't know the answer, is I tell them, you know what? I don't know the answer. You know, my job as a lawyer is not to know everything. My job as a lawyer is to find out what I need to know. And in a respect, your job is not that different. Nobody expects you to be an expert in everything. And if you try to be, that's where you can get in trouble. And that's where I think you're going to lose credibility with your client. If you're honest with them, if you're hardworking, if you're diligent, straightforward, and say, you know, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think I know somebody who does. Let me go out and find out, and I will report back. And then you do it. You will protect your credibility with your client. You'll protect your competence, and you'll do a better job. Now, you can look at valuation questions and then kind of turn to the client and say, well, what do you think about this? And talk about those numbers a little bit, or, did you notice that this was this way? These are things that are kind of just conversation starters that are not clear statements. You haven't made a representation. You haven't performed a particular analysis, but you have talked with your client and said, these are some things that you should take a look at. And I think most clients are appreciative of that. So briefly, what we won't cover today are a lot of the nitty gritty about real estate, title vesting, entities, and entity selection. That's very important in commercial deals. Very often, real estate investments are owned inside of some kind of a single purpose entity, an SPE, like an LLC or a partnership. We won't be talking about taxation issues such as the 1031 exchange, which is a giant issue in investment real estate. We won't be going over broker or escrow liability, except for places where I'm just warning you to be careful. And we won't be chatting much about disclosure duties, about valuation based on the cost approach, because those disclosure duties are, again, a very large area and really a separate part of our analysis. And the valuation approach, the cost approach evaluation is generally sort of a disfavored approach. And you'll see that most of the time when you look at appraisals, that appraisers don't really look at them with much weight, because the reality is that, we know if you have to buy a 3-bedroom home, middle market in Arcadia, it's going to cost you about $1.2 million. If you had to build it, it won't cost that much. And so the cost approach is really not very relevant in the way we look at valuation today. I wanted to remind you that the things I'm going to talk to you about today are just sort of one or two ways of looking at something. This is a huge field. Just as you know, there are many real estate licensees and many realtors, and everybody has a different way of approaching the business. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And so, don't complain if I tell you something that doesn't sound familiar to you, or it contradicts something that somebody else told you. It doesn't mean that that person is right and that I'm wrong, or vice versa. It just means that there are different ways to look at this. And each real estate investor has a different approach to how they look at evaluation and deciding to proceed with an investment. Okay, so what we're also going to do is we're not going to talk about a lot of obscure kinds of investments. I mean, there are people who invest in, energy wind farms, windmill farms, solar equipment generating facilities, all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're certainly not irrelevant in our society, but they're kind of boutique. And so we're going to try to just stick with the principles, because today is a general discussion. And I want you to just generally learn about how you look at these things, how you approach the questions of something, whether it's a good investment or a bad investment, quote unquote, and as well as the fact that what you're aiming for is sort of a glib understanding. It will take time for you to become an expert in this area. Okay. So talking about, again, the basics of investment transactions, they're really just like any other transaction you've done. It starts with a seller. There may be a listing process where you get the ink and you get the exclusive right to sell, or you may be presenting an unsolicited offer. That's very common in some parts of residential real estate, especially as I've seen in the higher value areas of the West Side. But it's also true in investments. A lot of the time, people don't like to list their buildings, but they might entertain an offer. And if you're an active broker, you're going to be aware of those possibilities. Obviously, that's a dangerous area. You have to protect yourself. You don't have control. You don't have protection over your commission unless you played your cards very carefully. But again, those are subjects for another day. So again, in terms of the structure of the transaction, a buyer is located. That may be with or without a broker. Generally, an escrow is appointed. A title company is selected to ensure title. There may be a lender if loans are involved. It's not an all-cash deal. And of course, there's an escrow closing. Okay, so what's different about investment deals? Well, in investment deals, there's a great deal more third-party involvement. What do we mean by that? You know, when you're buying or selling a house, when you're brokering the sale of a single-family home, sometimes people purchase those as investments, and so there may be a third party later, a tenant, who will eventually tenant the property. Sometimes, if a single family home is purchased as an investment, there's a third party now. There is a tenant in possession whose rights to occupy that property must be evaluated in that transaction. But it's much more common in conventional real estate investment transactions because there are contractual relationships with the parties that occupy those properties. Okay. There are also contractual relationships with adjacent property owners. There may be reciprocal easements for maintenance, for ingress or egress. There could be soils contaminations issues from other properties that are adjacent where the soil contamination has migrated to the subject property. There could be rights to use the property. There could be advertising like billboards and things of that nature. And then, of course, the tenants themselves are third parties to the transaction, and they have rights under their leases. So as a result of these extensive potential third-party relationships, there are heightened due diligence needs, and therefore heightened complexity says that there are heightened needs for both counsel and for you to be careful in that transaction. I want to talk about due diligence specifically. And I'm going to bring it up on a different slide again, but what I want to remind you as the broker is that, strictly speaking, you are not obligated to perform due diligence. And I would think that most managing brokers don't want you to do that. What do we mean by due diligence? Well, due diligence is a term of art referring to the purchaser's obligations to protect oneself, to exercise due diligence in acquiring knowledge and evaluating that investment. You know, in the law, we say that one may not engage in purposeful blindness or a willful blindness. And it means that you have a duty to look out for yourself. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. So you have a responsibility to protect yourself as the buyer and to evaluate something and determine whether or not the value supports the price that's being requested for the property. As the broker, your job is just to introduce the parties. Your job is not to perform due diligence. If you accept that responsibility, if you then decide that you are going to perform due diligence, you need to be very careful because it may not, again, be covered by your errors and omissions insurance, and you need to get it right. And so that's a rather large difference. It's one thing to kind of mumble and say, hey, did you notice this? Did you notice that? Maybe you ought to look at this. Maybe you should hire these inspectors. Maybe it's time to bring in, a due diligence team. Have you thought about hiring investment bankers? That kind of thing. But if you're going to actually do it yourself, crunch the numbers, you've got 100 unit, not 100 unit, but you had a 100,000 square foot shopping center with 28 tenants in it, and you're going to read the leases yourself and the CC&Rs and the preliminary title report and all the easements. Well, you better be qualified to do that. Okay, so I just want to remind you to be very careful about that. We will talk about things that sound like due diligence, and they are the issues that arise in a due diligence investigation. But mostly your job will be to procure that information for your client and to make sure that you've obtained enough information that is sufficient for the client's purposes. Now, it is the buyer's responsibility to determine what information the buyer needs. But if you're not careful, it could be later stated that you were assuming that responsibility and that if insufficient information was procured, that's your fault. Okay, so now let's talk about investment classes. And so what we did before was, again, we divided the world into two pieces. We talked about apartments and we talked about lease investments. And lease investments are different from apartments. And the reason why that is that we don't really care who lives in the apartment. That person is paying rent. Very often they're paying rent month to month. If Mr. Smith in apartment 1A moves out tomorrow, then Mrs. Brown may move into apartment 1A the next month. We'll put an ad in the paper or on Craigslist or on MLS. Somebody will come over, they'll look at it, they'll kick the tires, they'll sign a lease, and they'll be there for a year. So we don't really care who lives in that apartment. But if I own a big box store space, let's say I own there's a shopping center on Rosemead Boulevard between Broadway and Las Tunas, more or less, that has a Kmart in it and the Super A grocery store. Well, you know, Kmart's always nibbling on going away. So that's going to be a big empty space. It's probably a 30 or 40,000, actually it's probably larger than that. You know, a typical neighborhood grocery store has a footprint of about 45,000 square feet. If you know, that's probably a 50,000 square foot space, and we care who signs the lease there because it's a large undertaking, it's a large commitment, and so we really want to look carefully at who that renter is. In fact, we want to look more carefully at who the renter is and what the lease says about their relationship than we actually care about the real estate itself. You know, that Kmart store is really just a big box with some wires leading into it, wires and pipes. It's got gas, maybe, it's got electrical, it's definitely got water. There's a roof on it, hopefully it's watertight. Other than that, we really don't care about the building very much. What we care about is the piece of paper that's underneath it, that lease that says, I promise you I will make payments in X amount over Y period of time. That is what constitutes the basis for the valuation and the value of a leased investment. So we say leased investment, we're talking about an investment which is supported by a lease. Okay, and so therefore that leased investment is sold based on an evaluation of that income stream, the money that we can expect to come in as a result of that lease, and the integrity of that lease for the property. Okay, so the last time we spoke, I explained that other things where we don't really care about the tenants or who they are, that is, those are things like apartment buildings. They might be motels and hotels, right? Those are people in a transient tenancy. They come and go. Self-storage facilities. Who cares who's renting that little 100 square foot space? A place where you park your RV. We don't care about that either, right? We only care about who the tenant is in leased investments. I reminded you the last time that when we're looking at investments, and it's true actually about residential real estate as well, that there is an investment power pyramid. It's lonely at the top. As you move up the pyramid toward the larger investments, toward the higher value deals, toward the more expensive real estate, you get more power to negotiate things. And that's true if it's with the lender, with the title insurance company, with the brokers. I mean, everybody knows if you're going to sell a, $600,000, first-time buyer condo in El Monte, then, you're probably going to get a minimum of at least 5%, if not 6% commission. If you sell, one of these crazy palatial mansions in Arcadia and Santa Anita Oaks for $15 million, you're not going to get a 6% commission. You might get a 1 or 2% commission. And that's because of that investment power pyramid, that deal is a larger deal, that the principals then there have more power to negotiate that transaction cost, and that people are more willing to work for a lower percentage, but more money because of the size of that transaction. Okay. And that's true in the investment spectrum as well. So now let's talk about lease investments specifically. So, a leased investment is basically sold as a discounted income stream. What do we mean by that? We evaluate that investment based on how much money it's going to earn over the life of this investment. Okay, so in that respect, it's like a bond. You purchase something, a piece of paper that's a promise to pay. The value of that bond is dictated by what the return is that's negotiated with the buyer and the amount of the income stream. So in this respect, those two investment concepts are very similar. The difference, of course, with real estate is that it's generally more work. There's generally more risk, but there should be more return there, and there may be possible tax advantages and potential leverage. Leverage, I'm going to remind all of you, is the idea that in real estate, because we can borrow money to acquire something, we can use a smaller amount of money to control a larger amount of money. So if you buy a home for $2 million, you only have to put about $400,000 down to $500,000 down to qualify for the loan. That fact that you're taking $400,000 and controlling $2 million, that's what's called leverage. The same thing, of course, is true in investments. Very often then, in order to evaluate that investment, we're going to look at something called the capitalization rate or the cap rate. The cap rate is the most commonly used measure for valuation in looking at a leased investment. Sometimes they're used in apartment buildings too, but it's not as important a measure in an apartment building for reasons that I explained the last time. What a cap rate does is it provides you a constant measure for return, controlling out the cost of funds. Because what a cap rate does is because it's calculating the return on that investment at any given moment, it doesn't matter what interest rates are doing. It's not cash on cash return. Cash on cash return means I've invested so much money and I pay my mortgage too, and then I get a certain amount of money left at the end if I'm lucky. Very often that's a negative amount of money. But and so there's literally zero cash on cash return or a negative cash on cash return. But a cap rate doesn't care about that because we are evaluating the investment based on the net operating income and not taking into account what the cost of financing is. Why is that important? Well, what's important about that is that it allows us to engage in an apples to apples analysis. Okay, if I'm going to buy a shopping center for $10 million and I'm going to put $10 million down, then the cap rate is X. Let's say it's 5.0. If someone else is going to buy the same $10 million shopping center, but they're going to put $6 million down and they're going to borrow $4 million, their cap rate is still X. It's still 5%. It's still the same cap rate that I was going to get when I was going to pay cash. And so what that allows us to do is to continue to compare investments on a level playing field, regardless of what the financing considerations are. Okay. The distinction about cap rate is that it provides a snapshot in a given point in time. So today, the rents are this much, the expenses are this much, the price is this much, and therefore the cap rate is X. Internal rate of return is another measure of investment. And what it does is effectively it evaluates what the rate of return is at a number of different points in time. And so over a period of time, let's say 5 years, you can create an evaluation of what the return is over the 5-year period. So it's not a snapshot in time, it's a chunk of time. And in that respect, it's a more sophisticated analysis because it takes into account differing cash flows in and out. depending on what the assumptions are in that investment. It's a fairly sophisticated measurement tool though. And so it's not used by a lot of what I would call sort of retail or consumer type investors, people, under the $10 million range. The more sophisticated buyers, real estate investment trusts, sophisticated syndicators and so forth are more likely to use something like the internal rate of return. But it's, again, sort of a backup to the cap rate. The cap rate is still what they're initially going to evaluate. So let's talk about derivation of the capitalization rate. Okay. As I said a moment ago, what the cap rate does is evaluating the price of the property based on the net operating income. Remember, we're not taking into account what the cost of financing is. So we derive what is the net operating income. We take what is the proposed price, and we simply divide them. The net operating income divided by the price, the small number divided by the big number, equals the cap rate. And that's why it comes out as a fractional number, as a decimal number, 5%, 6%, 3%, 4%, 3.2%, that kind of thing, okay? Because the little number's over the big number, and we all remember from fractions that means it's going to result in a math result in a number which is less than 1, right? 1 divided by 2, 1/2 equals 0.5, right? 50%. And similarly, a cap rate is going to typically be a number below 1, because if you had a 100% or 100% cap rate, that meant you'd be doubling your money every year, and those investments are hard to find, okay? So NOI divided by price equals cap rate. Now we can manipulate that formula and say cap rate times price equals the NOI, and we can divide NOI by a cap rate and we can get the price, right? The NOI is now a bigger number. The cap rate is a fractional number. When we divide them, we're going to end up with the biggest number, the price. And now I always like to tell people that, I'm the first Chinese guy you met that was bad at math, okay? And that's a little racist, but I can get away with it because I'm a Chinese guy. I'm not really a big math maven, but I've grown to have really good facility with numbers like these. The easy way to look at it is just check your results. Did you get a big number or did you get a small number? Did you get a fraction or did you get a number that's a value greater than 1? If you're trying to hunt for the cap rate and you got a number that's greater than 1, you did something wrong, right? Because the cap rate is usually a percentage, or expressed as a percentage. Think of it as like interest that you get on your savings account in the bank. Okay? The bank doesn't pay you 100% interest. If you're lucky, the bank pays you about 1.2%, or maybe interest rates are going up, maybe as much as 2% on your money. But that's 0.02, right? And so when you look at a cap rate, the number's going to be ending up, somewhere around that range, around, let's say 5%, if you're lucky, okay? And therefore, that's how you confirm that you've derived a number, which is the cap rate. So it's just something that's important to remember when you're looking at your analysis. So we talked about this a little bit. We said, why do we use the cap rate? Okay, and the first thing is that the reason why it's not as important when we're talking about apartment buildings is because expense assumptions vary greatly from operator to operator in the operation of an apartment building. Some people hire a licensed plumber every time there's a leaky faucet. Some people get their toolboxes and go down and they fix them themselves. Well, that changes what becomes your expenses in operating that investment. And because your expenses are more variable in those types of investments, they affect the net operating income, because the net operating income is the gross operating income after subtracting expenses and vacancy. Okay, so because NOI is heavily affected in apartment buildings by the style of management, we don't rely on cap rate as much because it's less meaningful. It depends on what your assumptions are about expenses. In leased investments, where cap rates become affected and why they're important to use is that when we look at the leases will dictate the relationships of the landlord to the tenant. And we'll say what expenses are paid for by the tenant and what expenses are paid for by the landlord. In many leased investments, especially retail, what's called triple net retail, the tenants pay all of the expenses. But in office buildings, very often, tenants don't pay any of the expenses. They pay just the rent. Sometimes that's affected by what's called a load factor. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But because of those differences, we want to be able to calculate, given these leases in place, what is the net operating income on this investment? And that then gives us, again, a realistic evaluation of what the rate of return should be experienced to the buyer at a certain price. Okay? A cap rate, in effect, assumes stable lessor operating costs, because theoretically, we know in advance what expenses are absorbed by the tenants and what expenses are absorbed by the landlord. Okay. One of the places where this can make a very substantial difference is thanks to the beauty of Proposition 13. What happens is when a shopping center is sold, as property taxes go up, usually dramatically, because it's based on the new sale price. Some leases, especially by credit tenants that have more bargaining power, remember that investment pyramid discussion, they may cap the amount of the property tax increase that that tenant is required to pay. It may rule out reassessment on transfer. It may limit reassessment on transfer to one sale. It could be some variation of that. It could be an agreement to pay an increased real estate assessment based property tax increase to, X percent. If it's greater than X percent, then the tenant's costs are capped. So all of these things are variable, and they will affect the cap rate. Okay, they will affect NOI and therefore the cap rate. So office buildings are examples of leased investments. Shopping centers are examples of leased investments. We have things that are, we could call single tenant retail, standalone buildings. It might be, as in this photograph, a Starbucks store. It might be a bank. It could be a restaurant. It could be a fast food restaurant. Could be anything like that, a neighborhood drugstore, things of that nature. Okay. So now we're going to look at some numbers just to kind of give you, again, some sense of the interaction of these numbers. What I'd said the last time was that I was recycling an old presentation and that the numbers here are really for illustration purposes only. They do not represent what the real life marketplace is like today, okay? So I want to remind you that cash flow returns are really tiny today, but appreciation has been very high. And that's what people have been chasing, recognizing that cap rates are going to be very, very low, but that appreciation will make up for it over the long haul. So one other thing about cap rate, okay, and last time I talked about apartment buildings, and that apartment buildings are very often evaluated based on something called the gross rent multiplier, the GRM. The GRM is a multiple, okay? If the gross rent is $100,000 and the building sells for $1 million, then that's a 10 times gross price. But remember, the cap rate is a fraction, so it's a smaller number. And so its relationship to price is inverse. If something is more expensive, you buy a loaf of bread for $2 at Costco, but it's $3.50 at Ralph's. Well, you know, that's a bad example. Let's do it another way. When you're getting a smaller amount of money back on a larger amount of money invested, that means that that thing is by definition expensive. Okay, it's more expensive than something where you're getting more money back. So when a thing is more expensive, quote unquote, that's expressed with a lower cap rate. It's the inverse of the gross rent multiplier. If something's more expensive, then it has a higher GRM. So something that's relatively expensive has a lower cap rate, let's say 2% as opposed to 3.5%. If something is more expensive as an apartment building, then the multiplier is higher, 10 times gross as opposed to 9 times gross. Okay, so just remember that, you know, when you're just getting introduced to investments, this concept can be kind of confusing. And so it's important to, you know, kind of just keeping yourself in the right frame of mind so that you get comfortable with the mathematical relationships. So in this example, we looked at the gross rent as being $180,000. We had a vacancy factor of 10%, which would diminish that by $18,000, leaving you a total income of about $162,000. Expenses which are unrecouped. In other words, expenses that the landlord pays that the tenant doesn't pay. Let's say, hypothetically, that's another $18,000. That then gives us a net operating income of $144,000. If we assumed a 6% cap rate applied to the $144,000, we take the NOI divided by the cap rate, or $144,000 divided by 0.066%, and we derive a price or a value of $2.4 million. Okay, and I think, Peter, we're going to provide you, or we have already provided you with this PowerPoint, so you'll have it. If you'll just take this slide later and kind of play with the math, you'll see what I mean. Don't think that we do it for you here. I'm trying to remember. Actually, we did it for you here. So we take the numbers and we, well, no, not exactly. What we did was we gave you different examples of whether the NOI is $75,000, $1 million, or $60,000, and then compared that to all at the same price of 1.5 million. Okay, so obviously, if you're only making $75,000 net, as opposed to $100,000 net, that makes the example number one, the investment where you're making $75,000, more expensive because your return is higher in example number two, right? So what we're going to see is in that relationship that in number one, the example is a 5% cap rate. In number two, the example is a 6.7% cap rate. Again, you're making more money in example number two. In example number three, where the net operating income was the smallest, you're experiencing the lowest return, a 4% cap rate. Okay. Again, I mentioned here that they're inversely proportional. As the price goes up, the cap rate goes down. Okay. These cap rates are, by the way, almost astronomical. Nowadays, it's very hard to pull this kind of money, this kind of cap rate. I mean, if you're spending $25 million, you can get potentially a 6.5% cap rate. But if you're buying something for $2 million, you're probably going to be getting more like a 4% or a 3.5% cap rate.
David, so in your examples, if the market rate is 6.5% and the cap rate is only 6, then you're losing money from the start, right? If the cost of borrowing is 6%, yeah, and your rate is below that, your cap rate is only 6%, and you know you're losing money. Well, you could say that, but remember, cap rate is not adding in appreciation, right? Yeah, right. So what's going on here is you're looking at cash flow, okay? And cash flow
I mean, if assuming we don't have a recession, assuming the tenants don't go bankrupt, assuming that we don't something catastrophic doesn't occur, and the tenants all perform, well, in those situations, then that cap rate, the cash flow is probably pretty reliable, right? So um, so I think that's fair. When you're saying, oh, you'll get appreciation, I remember my old manager in real estate said, like, oh, so you're relying on the theory of the greater fool, that some idiot's going to come in behind you and pay you more for something. Okay. Well, that might be true, but I'll tell you what, over the 30 some odd years that I've been in real estate, that's always been true. Some idiot eventually always comes along and pays more for something. Okay. And I mean, that's glib, but the reality is there's this thing called inflation. Okay. And my mom and my dad, God bless them, my dad had roughly, he says, 6 months to a year of education. Okay. My mother has no formal education at all, not in China, not in America. She's illiterate in English and Chinese. She speaks Mandarin, Cantonese, Shanghainese, English. She's super bright. She's made millions and millions of dollars in real estate, but but she's not literate. Okay. The only thing you really need to be a real estate genius is have staying power. If you own something long enough, it will eventually make sense. Okay. So, that's just true about most things. I always say I hate the inland empire and the high desert. To me, they're the first places to go down and the last places to go up. I wish I owned all my real estate I owned in the West Side, because all of it is selling for fabulous prices I never ever would have anticipated. So, the reality is that things do appreciate, and that's why even though cap rates are low, those investments still make a lot of sense. Okay. And, part of the government's efforts in terms of manipulating the money supply and to make the cost of borrowing higher is because we want to try to rein in some of that appreciation. It will eventually work, but it doesn't mean that it will stop appreciating. Okay. So, where do we get cap rates from? Well, cap rates come from the market. That's just like saying, again, why is this house in San Marino selling for $3 million? Because all the rest sold for $3 million. Okay. And so that came in at, $1,200 a square foot or whatever it was. And that's what, where those prices come from. A good friend of mine just sold his one of his homes in Beverly Hills, and he got $1,000 a square foot, which is just crazy money. So, cap rates come from the marketplace. What investors are demanding is what will dictate what the cap rates, the prevailing quote unquote cap rates are. But there are other methods of valuation used that you should look at in the valuation of these things: the cost per square foot, the cost per net rentable square foot, and so on. The other thing to remember about cap rate is it could involve other types of income. As I mentioned earlier, is there a billboard sign on the property that throws off income? Are there vending machines? There used to be pay telephones back in the day when we used those things, and that sometimes those things threw off income. Things of that nature, which can also contribute income to the bottom line and therefore affect NOI, and then by application, the cap rate or price. So now let's talk specifically about retail. And this is a very large area because, retail is really everything from one standalone store. It could be a storefront on Las Tunas Drive. It could be a strip retail center, that we built so plentifully in the 80s. They all had looked the same. They all had a donut store, a liquor store, convenience store, a nail salon, and maybe a laundromat. They were all built by a company called Centers Business Management, or La Mancha. And they built literally, I think, 5,000 centers in Southern California back in the 80s. Many of them are still around. It could be what's called a neighborhood shopping center that's usually anchored by a grocery store or a drugstore or both, and it has a number of smaller tenants in between. Examples of that are, for instance, on Las Tunas Drive, there's the one that has it has the tofu place, and it has the yogurt land in there. It's got the Samwoo barbecue restaurant on the east end, and it's an L shape, right? So that's a neighborhood shopping center, although I believe at this point there's no grocery or drugstore anchor. I don't remember now off the top of my head. So all of these things are retail, okay? And restaurant spaces are viewed as being retail, even though we kind of say, well, they don't sell things, but basically that's a retail application. Typically, those traditionally in Southern California, those types of investments are leased as triple net, which means net of taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance costs. Okay. There are other types of tenancies which could be called absolute net, where the tenant pays all the costs for everything: the cost of replacements, the cost of maintaining the roof, the parking lot blacktop, and everything. And a typical example of that is a standalone restaurant building on its own pad. Okay. A common area maintenance charge is just that. These are charges charged to the tenant to maintain the common area. If you have a neighborhood shopping center and it has 8 smaller tenants and a grocery anchor and a drugstore anchor, in between those places, you've got garbage cans outside for people to throw away their trash. You've got parking space for everybody in that shopping center to use. You have lighting on the exterior of that shopping center. You might have security or maintenance people coming through to clean up the place, dust off the place, throw out the garbage. You have to pay for insurance to ensure that those common areas, in case someone slips and falls or the whole building burns down. You've got, of course, utility costs that relate to all of those things. And sometimes you're also paying for a common hot water heater. So those things are common area maintenance. And so the landlord takes that number and aggregates it and then allocates the amount of the tenant's pro rata share based on the number of square feet that tenant has in relation to the entirety. So if it's a 10,000 square foot center and you've got 500 square feet, they divide 500 by 10,000, comes out again with that fractional number, okay? And that's your percentage of the common area maintenance charge. Now let's compare that to office buildings and how they set up. So office buildings are typically not a triple net type of investment. It's just not a practical way to run an office building. And so it's very unusual for that to be in place for an office building. Instead, typically what is charged to the tenant is either it's treated as what's called full service gross, which means that the landlord pays for all the operating expenses, or perhaps a modified gross where the tenant pays for some specific costs that the landlord doesn't pay for. Okay, that might be, your separately metered electrical bill for your space. But again, that's very uncommon in an office building. Because it could be something that is like a small suburban office building and it only has 2 tenants. That's where you might have a setup where, each tenant pays their own electrical bill because there's literally no common area lighting, right? So it makes sense at that point to say, well, Bill, you pay for your electricity, I'll pay for my electricity, and we'll both be happy. I won't accuse you of jacking up the electrical bills if you work 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, and run your air conditioning all through the summer, but I'm only there 3 days a week. I don't complain because, you're paying for your electricity and I'm paying for mine, okay? What happens though with office buildings a lot of the time nowadays is that you charge instead a load factor to the tenant. And I previously officed at 444 Huntington Drive, and that's what they did is they said, okay, David, you have 1,500 square feet, but we're going to treat it like you're renting 1,650 square feet. And what that extra 150 square feet was a load factor, which addressed a lot of the common area expenses in operating the building. I did not pay more. I did not, if the cost of insurance went up, pardon me, they didn't charge me more for that. But I did have a regular escalation in my lease rate, which I paid for and which was intended to address changes and increases in operating expenses. Okay. And sometimes there might be an expense stop where the landlord says, I'm going to pay this much, which might be considered a base year expense. And then after that, increases which come along are then passed through to the tenant. Okay. That's also true in retail, but it's more typical here in the office building analysis. So earlier we talked about due diligence, okay, and I kind of getting the sense that I'm falling behind on time, so I want to go through it more quickly here. I'm not doing too bad. So, and I just, in the caption here, I changed the caption of this presentation to say, due diligence, are you? So we talked a little bit earlier about, are you performing the due diligence? And again, you want to be very careful about that. I've already reviewed that, so I'm not going to restate it. When we look at due diligence on lease investments, there are many things to look at. I don't have it on this list, but we talked about the preliminary title report. Let me see, we might have it on the next page. There are leases to analyze because again, each tenant may have negotiated a different deal with the landlord. What are the rent escalations? What are the expense stops? Has the tenant negotiated not to pay for certain expense escalations? There will be estoppel certificates. An estoppel certificate is a certificate signed by the tenant confirming what the terms of the lease are and that the tenant is performing and that the landlord doesn't owe them anything. That will be necessary. It will be required by the lender to close that transaction. There will be, loan documents to review if there's financing. In commercial deals, loan documents are not standard. It's not like when we buy, a single family home and everything is issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and those documents are substantially identical from lender to lender. There will be more financial review. There will be underlying tenant applications possibly. There will be income and expense records. There will be an operating history for the property. All of these things require someone to look at them in order to properly evaluate that investment. When you look at those income and expense numbers, you have to ask, are the rents conforming with the representations? You'll get a flyer from the listing broker that says the cap rate is this and the rents are that. Are those actually true? Are they consistent with the leases? Has the seller disclaimed liability for representations and pushing all that responsibility on the buyer? That's very common in especially in larger investment deals. Again, are the leases limited or modified to prevent COLAs, cost of living adjustments? Are the tenants solvent? Are the rent histories verified? Are the CAMs actually being collected? When the economy goes bad, when tenants are not performing, that's one of the first places that tenants start to default on their leases. So they say, well, I can pay you the rent, but I can't pay you the CAM right now. And it might be that the landlord says, okay, well, you'll owe it to me later. That's an indication, though, that the tenant is starting to deteriorate, starting to go bad. And so the question is are you experiencing that now? And if so, you need to know that because you're evaluating tenant quality, okay? We talked about the estoppel certificates. They're always left for the very last minute. Tenants hate them. They don't understand them. They're scary looking and they look real legal. They're even worse if you have to get them for apartment buildings. There's a confusion. Does a lender want to use the form or the buyer's form going to be used? Sometimes there's a disagreement about that. And potentially these are problem areas for loan approval and litigation later. There's something else that you see in commercial deals that's called a SINDA, Subordination, Non-Disturbance, and a Torment Agreement. And this is a very long title for a very simple idea, okay? What it says is that the tenant and the lender reach an agreement. And it says, if the buyer goes under, if the buyer goes bad, I, as the lender, agree to protect you as the tenant. You will be able to continue to stay on the property. You agree, tenant, that you will pay me, the lender, your rent instead of paying it to the owner if the owner is in default. And in exchange for that, I will agree to continue to honor your leasehold. That's the non-disturbance part, that the tenancy will not be disturbed in the event of the action by the lender to foreclose and to take over the property or to appoint a receiver to take on the operation of the property. The tenant attorns, becomes related to the lender as the new landlord at during that period and upon foreclosure. Okay, loan docs. Again, this is the same kind of time pressure that you see in residential transactions. The difference is that they are negotiable. And this is difficult though, because they come out with a very short amount of time before the closing of the transaction. The buyer is very often completing an IRS Section 1031 exchange. This is a problem because you have limited negotiating power because you are not double apping typically, and you have committed to a lender. And the negotiability is variable, but there are definitely terms which can be negotiated in the loan docs, especially in larger loans. Let's talk briefly about borrower opinion letters. These are traps that the lender sends out at the closing and says, by the way, borrower, we want your lawyer to verify that that the borrower has no defenses to the loan docs, that you're solvent, that you're duly organized and existing under California law, and so on and so forth, okay? These are scary things. They don't typically involve you, but since your job is to get paid, I raise it because they can be something that pops up at the last minute if your client is not being assisted by counsel in the closing of that transaction. They won't know what to do with them. You'll be out rushing around trying to find a lawyer to do it at the last minute, and you'll have a hard time with it because lawyers don't like them. In effect, what the lawyers say is that, you know, I have said everything here's okay. If you don't like it, come sue me. And so attorneys don't like these things. I always water them down, okay? They're also going to be asking, as I said a moment ago, that for corporate status opinions, that the company's in good standing and so forth. Sometimes these things take some time to go get. You need to get certificates from Secretary of State and things of that nature. So you want to be aware of this. You know, if you've got a big commercial deal pending, you're going to make $100,000 on this closing. You don't want to see it blow up. You don't want to see it delayed. You don't want to see it derailed. You don't want to see the buyer's 1031 window close, and now they've got no motivation to close that transaction. All of these things are important to you as the broker, but they're very important to your client because, of course, you're greasing the skids and making sure that deal goes through as effectively as possible. So this has been a super quick overview, a lot of information provided to you. I'm just going to remind you that, you know, what we talked about today. We looked at valuation incomes again, valuation methods again. We talked about different types of real estate investments, you know, the differences between lease investments and apartment investments, again, based on that integrity of that income stream and how strong that piece of paper is. We talked about special issues in transactions like loan docs, opinion letters, SINDAs, and the role of counsel there, okay? That's pretty much it. Peter talked a little bit about, modern issues regarding conversions of commercial space to residential. I'm actually not terribly familiar about that. Yes, I'm aware that the law is changing in this area, but we didn't prepare anything to talk with you about that today. I will remind you that it's very difficult to do in our community. I'm just going to stop this slide here so we get back on together. You know, I was talking with Peter about this yesterday on the phone. And the thing to remember about the San Gabriel Valley is actually it's a very ancient community. Okay. Remember the San Gabriel mission was the birthplace of where the old mission priests walked down basically Mission Road to Alvera Street and then created the city of Los Angeles with the founding of Alvera Street. Okay, so that tells you how old San Gabriel is. And because it's very old, what we see is pre-modern parcel construction. I was reminding Peter, when you look at retail space on Main Street in Alhambra, and to some degree, on Las Tunas Drive and Temple City and Arcadia and so forth, you see the configuration of these parcels is very strange. You might have 50 feet of frontage, but the space is 150 feet deep. Okay, and that's not very useful for retail, right? Retail, you want to have a lot of frontage because you want window space. People, historically, wanted to look at things. Again, how we do retail today has dramatically changed, and that change has only been exacerbated and accelerated by the pandemic. I rarely buy anything in a store anymore. And I'm sure it's all of you too. Every day I've got Amazon trucks pulling up to my house, and I don't shop that much. When you get to be an old guy like me, you don't buy that many things. Peter, maybe you could appreciate this too. When I was young, I used to wear out my clothes all the time. And now, I've got socks that are 25 years old. Things just don't wear out anymore. Okay. But, so how we perceive retail, how we use retail has dramatically changed. But that idea, that frontage, that hasn't really changed anything because nobody really wants to be in a silo. You go into those spaces, you have 50 feet of glass on the front and the rest of it are blank walls going to the back of the property. What is that appropriate to use for? You can't turn that into residential space because there aren't any windows. If you live in an apartment or if you live in a house, I promise you, you have windows, okay? Because human beings need sunlight, to protect us for our circadian rhythms. We need to see the coming and going of daytime. That's why casinos don't have windows. They don't want you to know what time of day it is, okay? So it's not easy to repurpose that kind of space into a residential usage. And so we have a great deal of challenge ahead of us in terms of trying to exploit and monetize changes in the law that are intended to give us more opportunities for residential development. It's very difficult in the San Gabriel Valley. Curiously, when you, especially like on Las Tunas Drive, what you see is, because they are ancient uses, is you see residential above retail, which is the way old cities were set up. In New York City, in San Francisco, in Chicago, you had a corner liquor store, convenience store, deli, where people could run down and buy a quart of milk or a loaf of bread or something like that, with residential above. That's the way America used to look before the advent of the supermarket. Those things did not always exist. As our society modernized, we came away from that model because we said, you know what? It's noisy and smelly if there's a hamburger joint downstairs and I'm upstairs. If there's a local, tavern downstairs and I rent an apartment upstairs, that's not enjoyable. I don't like to have the juxtaposition of those uses. And so we started to move away from that toward the suburban model, where we had neighborhood shopping centers where I drive up, I go to a Vons or a Ralph's or an Albertsons, I buy my stuff and I take it home. With the increasing density of our society, with our desire to reduce our carbon footprint, with our desire to get away from automobile usage and living at home, what we have seen now is the return of mixed use development, which is what we had at the turn of the century, not this century, the last century. Okay. So, in Pasadena, the Paseo, Colorado was one of the early mixed use investments of a very, kind of spotty performance. But the idea was to have people living close to a space where they work. And to have that convenience to cut down on motor vehicle trips. So we are changing back to a time which actually existed 150 years ago in our society, because we're realizing that, hey, there's a reason to have this and there's a lot of good things to be derived from it. It's very challenging to pull off here in the San Gabriel Valley. And it's going to require a lot of change in order to be able to exploit that, because we have to change the configuration of that space. If you take that Kmart store that I mentioned earlier, right, and you want to turn that into residential usage, how you're going to have to do it is you're going to have to tear it down and build a horseshoe, right? You're going to have to carve out the center in order to create window space on those sides, in order to have light and air access to apartment units or condo units, around a common courtyard. Okay. And so as a result of that, although you have a 50,000 square foot footprint, you're only going to end up with maybe 15,000 square feet of buildable space. The rest of it will be open space, green space, light and air, staircases, interior passageways, something like that. And then you'll be able to go up. So maybe you'll have 30,000 square feet of residential space in that area, which is only about 30 apartments, right? So, will that pencil? That's the question. Okay. Now, you do have a parking lot. So you don't have to build you don't have to build subterranean garage. You don't have to provide for additional parking. In fact, you should be overparked, which is delightful, okay? Because you have to have 4 parking spaces per 1,000 for retail space. So hopefully you'll have more parking there, but we're a long way from getting to that, okay? It could happen, and the more dense, the more crowded we become, the more likely it is to occur. But we have a long way to get there.
Very, very, very insightful, David. Yeah, those are very good thoughts. How about, what do you think of the idea of turning the shopping malls, the abandoned shopping mall into a mixed-use project? It's also very challenging, right?
Well, it's really interesting. I was at a meeting where Peter Lowy, who was the chairman of Westfield at that time, was speaking, and this was in, I want to say it was around 2008. I think it was around the time of the financial crisis, and he was sort of trumpeting. He said, I was at a meeting and a man walked up to me and said, 3/4 of retail is going to go out of business. What do you say about that? What are you going to do? And he said, invest in the other quarter. Okay. But he's gone. He's gone. They sold Westfield, and Westfield is in a lot of trouble today internationally. There's a lot of pressure on Westfield. I was at a meeting in 2008, and one of the speakers, who's a prominent leasing lawyer, said, in America today, there's 1,700 square feet of retail for every man, woman, and child. 1,700 square feet of retail. What that means is that you, Peter, and me, and Katherine Johnson, and Steve Sattler, and Cecilia, and Oscar, and Virginia, we have to go out and spend enough money shopping to support 1,700 square feet of retail every month of the year. Not just us, by the way, our children, our parents, and everybody we know. okay? I mean, that tells you that retail is overbuilt in America, and that was 15 years ago, okay? So, what does it mean? I don't know. That's over my pay grade. I'm just not that smart. It does say that what we need to be thinking about is repurposing that space. And what you see, and I was at a meeting about 10 years ago that discussed this, that modern shopping center development is changing. One theory was at that time that within 20 years, we would not be driving cars anymore, that we would have a fully autonomous vehicle driven society. It doesn't look like that's going to be true, but maybe 20 years from now, it might be true. And the reason for that is that the cars are getting very smart. What Caltrans said at that meeting, because Caltrans was at the meeting, they said 20 years ago, we ran a test with 10 autonomous vehicles driving across the desert, spaced 6 inches apart for 50 miles, and they did it perfectly. Because the vehicles were reading each other electronically. Until our cars are actually connected to each other, the theory of autonomous vehicles doesn't really work. Once we have a fully autonomous vehicle society, then what will happen is we will have no more traffic accidents, because human beings cause traffic accidents. Yes, it's true, these idiots drive their Tesla cars and the Tesla makes mistakes. Remember, that's because it's relying on cameras. If that vehicle has sensors and its computers are reading the computers in the other vehicle, you're no longer relying on cameras to ascertain what the threat is. You actually have radar and sensors that can see where that other vehicle is, what the obstacle is. When that car stops, you stop. And what it means is that when you have a fully autonomous vehicle fleet, is that those cars can operate, like 2 inches apart. What will that do to traffic? They can do that down the 405, 100 miles an hour, okay? Because the computers are operating the vehicles. It's not you and me. We're not playing with the radio. We're not texting. We're not drunk. Well, actually, we could be doing all of those things now, right? It won't change the performance of that vehicle. So because of that, shopping center developers started about 10 years ago, or maybe even longer than that, started to redevelop the parking areas to have movable plates and movable walls, because they were theorizing that soon we will have more and more reduced need for parking, because if you have an autonomous fleet, you don't have a vehicle. You just tell your smartphone, get me a car. It shows up at your front door. You get in, you get to your destination, you get out, and it leaves to pick up the next person. Okay. So that also means that you don't have personal vehicle ownership. You're not paying car insurance anymore. You're only paying Uber fees. Okay. It's a very, very different view of the world if you extrapolate the role of technology in our society. And those things are changing how we look at and design retail and residential. There's a new project going up, the Alexan project in Arcadia at 1000 Santa Anita Avenue. That's a transit-based development project where they're building 316 residential units with a retail component. And they have a reduced parking requirement because the theory is that those users will be using the Gold Line to come and go. We're moving more toward that and beginning to change our requirements based on our anticipated change in our needs for the, certainly for a internal combustion engine vehicle, but even for electric vehicles. So, what does this mean? 5 years ago, if you said to me, David, we're going to be doing all of our meetings on this thing called Zoom, I would have said, Peter, you got to quit smoking that stuff. It's bad for you. Okay. But now after the pandemic, we've seen these changes happen in our society like that. Overnight. right? We became accustomed to dealing with each other this way. This is straight out of 2001, you know? This is science fiction stuff. If this idea, you know, 40 years ago, if you said we're all going to be running around with these things, which are like an incredibly powerful supercomputer in the palm of your hand, okay, you'll be able to talk to people in Beijing or anywhere else on the planet, and really even in outer space if we had anybody to talk to. If you said that that was possible, I would have said that's crazy. That's Dick Tracy nonsense. You know, how can you do that? Literally now, if you have an Apple Watch, you have that little two-way wrist radio that Dick Tracy was talking on in the 1950s, right? So the world is changing very, very quickly. Trying to figure that out, you know, that's part of our job, because if we can get in front of that, you know, I used to call this tomorrow's Wall Street Journal. If you had tomorrow's Wall Street Journal, you wouldn't be here right now because you'd be filthy rich, right? If you knew what was going to happen in advance, you'd be able to anticipate those trends and monetize them. That is part of our job. I mean, not as brokers and as lawyers. I mean, for ourselves, you know, I try to figure out, where are we going? You know, what is happening here? You know, how is the world changing, and how does that best suit me? You know, I'm sitting in a home. It's 3,000 square feet. I bought this home last year. I bought it because we were in the pandemic and my associates were telecommuting in. I was sitting in an empty office paying $5,000 a month for rent, and I thought, why am I doing this? My lease was coming up. Instead, I bought a new home. I bought a larger home that I could have some dedicated office space in. You know, I just figured out that I didn't need to do my business this way anymore. I have an office on Huntington Drive. I can meet clients there when I want to. And I'm very straightforward about this. You know, I'm not embarrassed to say, oh, you don't actually have an office. I'm like, yeah, and that's really smart, huh? You know, I paid thousands and thousands of dollars for 25 years to rent my conference room in my office. And I used it 10 times a year, you know? So your job is the same. It's to figure out, where is the trend? Where are things going? How can you help people? And it's educated guesswork, but if it's educated guesswork, that's better than just guesswork, okay? In terms of, you know, what does the future hold? Where are we going to make money? What are things going on? You know, so for all of you right now, and I've been through a lot of real estate markets, and so has Peter, okay? We're guessing right now, I'm sorry, I'm just going to turn on my air. We're guessing that we are on the edge potentially of a recession. It's probably not a real estate recession, okay? Because, you know, after Dodd-Frank, after the 2008 financial crisis, the banking community became very sophisticated, very careful about lending. And so as a result, we don't have the fully leveraged society that we did, you know, back in the 2000s and in the 90s, okay? So we're probably not looking at a true real estate recession, and so we're probably okay. Having said that, we definitely know the market has changed. All of you are slower today because buyers think they should be getting a better deal right now, and sellers still think they should be getting the prices they got 6 months ago, right? You know, when buyer and seller agree on value, you have regular market flow. Deals take a reasonable amount of time to occur, right? If I go to buy a loaf of bread and it costs $4 and I expect it to be $4, I'll buy it. Better yet, let's use a gallon of gas, okay? A gallon of gas has fluctuated a lot. When I drive by the gas station and a gallon of gas is selling for $6.99 a gallon, I look at it and I say, you know, a lot of stuff's going on right now. I happen to drive a hybrid. I'll wait a few days. I'll buy my gas in a couple of days when it comes down to $6.25 a gallon, okay? The same thing goes on when you're trying to buy a house. If you think this house should sell for $2 million, but the seller thinks it should sell for 2.5, you're not going to write an offer right now. You're going to wait because you think you're betting on the market sinking. You're betting on that seller getting educated. You're betting on time wearing down that seller. As a result, brokers don't make money because buyer and seller expectations are not linked right now. Buyers think they should be getting this. Sellers still think they should be getting this because they're still wedded to the go-go market of 6 months, 2 years ago to 6 months ago, right? So until people get acclimated to new values, you're going to have a slower market. It's going to reduce. What does that mean to you as a broker? It means you have to get out and educate people. You need to futurize what's happening. You need to see what's happening and start to educate people about, here's what's likely going to happen. Yes, interest rates are going to come down. Right now, interest rates are very high. Interest rates are going to go up another 3/4 of a point probably in November. That's, because of inflation. That's what the Fed is pointing at, right? Interest rates are going to go higher. That seller is going to have more pressure on that person because every time those rates go up, in effect, that property value gets hit because fewer people can qualify for that loan. And therefore, you've got less competition for that price. And if you have less competition, you've got less pressure on the price to go up and more pressure on the price to go down, right? What do you tell buyers right now? Do it now. Buy it now because it's going to be temporary. Buy that house now. Interest rates are going to go higher. The sellers are going to be under pressure. But guess what? 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when we're in recession, 2 years from now, when Joe Biden's trying to get reelected, or Gavin Newsom, they're going to be saying what? Fed, we need to get those interest rates down because they want to pull the economy out of recession. We are going to see interest rates coming down at that time, probably, if inflation has not stuck around, if inflation has moderated. What does that mean for you? Yeah, you bought that house with, at a 4.5% or 5% interest rate, okay? Refi. When rates go down, you refi, okay? You're going to suffer with it for a little while, but when the rates go down and you refi, guess what's going to happen to your house? It's going to go up, right? So you want to take this economic information and think about the arguments that are persuasive to what you want to do based on what's going on out there. One, it'll make it sound like you're totally a smart guy, okay? But the other thing is that it's based in reality, okay? We know this from experience. If interest rates go to 7%, and it could happen, okay? It's not going to stay there forever, all right? There's too many political pressures, too many things going on. We are headed for a worldwide recession at this time, okay? The United States will actually do better than most other places, according to what you read. But probably we're headed for recession too, okay? Eventually, in order to pull us out of recession, rates will come down. Okay?
Very, very insightful and very practical. David.
Thanks so much, everybody.
So
it's really great to see you all. And somebody has a question, I think, chat. Can I get Davy's information? Let me give you a phone number, okay, for my office. It's 626, let me see, 62, oops, I'm in the wrong place. This is the problem with too many computers. 626-921-0393. Okay, and that's David at davidfuesq.com. Okay, does that look right? That looks right. Okay, thank you so much for having me. And remember about the stuff I said today, I could be 100% wrong, okay? But it's one person's opinion, okay? And I really appreciate you inviting me. I'm sorry for going over time and taking more time with you today. Looking forward to seeing you all in the flesh again soon. Peter, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, David.
And it's great to see you.
We
okay.
ran a little bit over time, but it's well worth it. Thank you so much. I hope
all right. Thank you. Thanks everybody for suffering with me.
In-person meeting with us someday, and that would be good too.
I'd love to do that again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
All right,
guys. I know it's all time, and so we'll see you next month. We'll have the commercial meeting the third week of November. Okay. All right. Nima,
you,
see
David.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye-bye. Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter.